All right, so I'm excited. I'm talking to Rolf Potts today, who is a travel writer, journalist, university lecturer, public speaker, specializing in travel. He's the author of two books, Vagabonding and A Common Guide to the Art of Long-Term World Travel, and Marco Polo, the Gover, Stories and Revelations from One Decade as a Post-Modern Travel Writer. I personally picked up the Vagabonding book from Rolf about 2 months into my travels, almost 5 years ago, and I remember at the time it gave me a really unique feeling of adventure. It really deepened and made my personal travels much more meaningful, which followed afterwards, which much more connection and exploration in the places I was visiting. So I'm really excited chatting to you, Rolf, and welcome to the show.
Yeah, it's good to talk to you and good to hear that you've been spending some time traveling in recent years.
Yes, for the last 5 years in total.
Yeah.
I think a great starting point is maybe you can cover your background, maybe what kind of led you in general to this kind of lifestyle and to start traveling.
Well, this is the 25th anniversary of my first vagabonding trip, which was 7.5 months by van through North America, at which point I thought I would scratch my travel itch and get on with my workaholic American life. That obviously didn't happen. That's the travel plan. You know, I took that trip sort of for existential reasons. Like I wasn't really sure if life or society would give me the free time to travel until I was very old. I wanted to travel while I was young. And so I found ways to make it happen. And then the more I traveled, and I'm sure you experienced this, and I tell my readers this a lot of the time, is once you're out on the road, you start learning things in a very vivid and meaningful way, regardless of what advice I had gotten beforehand. And really, this was 1994, so there wasn't an internet to give me examples of other people doing a similar thing to me. But basically, I just wanted to have this adventure so that I could get on and be a normal American workaholic, and I'm still waiting to be an American workaholic. So I traveled. I lived in a van life before hashtag van life in 1994. I just revisited that journal, and it was just an amazing trip. It's sort of like time traveling back to my early 20s, and the mindset that I had back then, and just the changes I was going through. And so I think the trip. Not only does it travel differ from where you go, but at what age you do it. So my travels in my 20s, I'm in my 40s now. My travels in my 20s just had different questions surrounding them than my travels in my 40s. And then this is also the 20th anniversary of my Asia travels. And I can talk about that some more if you're interested. But maybe, I guess I tried to write a book about that 1994 travels, and it didn't work. So I went to Asia. I lived in Korea and taught English for a couple of years. And then... excuse me, 20 years ago is when I really became a travel writer full-time and started traveling full-time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so what was your mindset, and which age did you start your first travel in Asia?
Well, I moved to Korea when I was 26, and that's not really travel. It was expat life, but in a way, living as an expatriate, I think is as important as travel, especially when you're young or at the beginning of your travel writing career or your traveling career, because you just learn a lot as an expat. You learn how other cultures are different, not necessarily in a good or bad way, but that's just the way they are. And so a lot of instincts that helped me for my travels that came later are things that I learned from working in another culture. So I was 28 before I started my full-time vagabonding across Asia. I was 23 when I traveled across North America, and then 2 years of expat life. And then, yeah, I just turned 28 when I started what eventually became a 2.5-year journey across Asia. And the last thing I did on that trip was write Vagabonding.
So with which mindset did you come maybe to this travel, and how maybe is it different from your mindset today, being doing it for over 20 years?
Well, there's an extent to which travel is travel. You know, I was in Sumatra right around New Year's this year, and just being in a new place and smelling it and seeing it and just having that experience of newness, that excitement never goes away. But 20 years ago, I think it was much more tied into that initial existential instinct, like that I really want to live my life in a good way. You know, that I don't want to just passively live the life that others think I should live. but I should travel the world in such a way that it broadens my life and it teaches me lessons about the world and about myself. And it has fun. You know, I tell readers a lot of times that it's good to be serious about life, but it's good to be serious about fun too. So it was a mix, I think, of serious inquiry and a serious desire to enjoy myself and to just sort of figure out what my life consisted of. And so I think to an extent my travels in my 20s were much more foundational than my travels in my 40s. You know, I'm a much more experienced and fully formed person in my 40s. And so in a way, travel is easier. It's a little bit less affecting because on those early vagabonding journeys, like every day was mind-blowing and life-changing, right? Whereas I'm just more of a fully formed person. I'm more of myself, and I've sort of become, for lack of a better word, a travel expert. People come and ask me about travel. I always tell people
20
that
years does it, yeah.
yeah, 20 years of doing it does it. And I always say that, you know, as a traveler, you're always an outsider, and so you're always sort of new. But I'm happy to give travel advice to people who have those same questions that I had 20 or 25 years ago. And those are important questions to be asking, which is, you know, how do I spend my life? How can I do the things I dreamed of doing?
Mm-hmm. Was there anything that led you to start asking those questions? Like any book, anything, or anyone who influenced you to start asking those questions, like how to spend your life and not being sucked into what they want you to do, maybe in home, which is maybe get a job and workaholic in America?
Yeah, it was probably a combination of life circumstances and books. My grandfather was a Kansas farmer who'd worked hard his whole life. He started farming when he was 15. He had an eighth grade education, and he had, you know, if anybody had earned his retirement, it was him. He'd worked hard his whole life, but the time he got to retirement age, his health wasn't the best. His wife, my grandmother, had Alzheimer's disease. He had to stay and take care of her. And so I realized that at a very sad emotional level that life just doesn't reward you with free time. And if you dream of doing something amazing, you should do it. And then, you know, at the same time in my 20s, I was reading books, a lot of books which you see appearing in Vagabonding, like Henry David Thoreau and John Muir, and especially Walt Whitman, but even the Bible and the Upanishads. I think there's a long spiritual tradition that we talk about, but we forget about sometimes, that actually there's parts of the Bible and Hindu scriptures and really any serious religious tradition that says, hey, maybe your life isn't about what you own. Maybe your life is about the moment and what you make of it.
Mhm. All right. Could you maybe define what is vagabonding like at this point?
Sure. Vagabonding, there's a very concise quote in the book, which I probably should have memorized by now, but it's the time of taking time off from your normal life to travel in earnest. It's not just a vacation where you're using time that's been given to you, a week or a month or however much time you get for a vacation, but it's about creating time. It's about taking time off from your normal life to travel in an earnest way and travel in an in-depth way. And there's no hard definition to that. If you can find 6 weeks, that's fine. If you can find 6 years, that's great too. So it's a personalized thing and it's not a contest. It's about just personally finding the best way of traveling through the world.
And when you started, you knew you were vagabonding, or you just really kind of formed into it and you really don't even have any plan to do this?
That's a good question. I actually had a very concise plan. Like that first trip I wanted through North America, I wanted to see so much that I don't know if I planned every day, but I'd planned every week. And part of the reason I made that plan was just to sort of get me out the door and keep me moving. I don't think I've ever planned a trip that detailed before. I always plan trips, but part of the reasons I planned in such detail for that trip was just to sort of reassure myself that it was possible and reassure myself that at this day I would be here. And so I think that there's a big imaginative aspect to travel, that you imagine yourself traveling before you go, and making that plan allowed me to actualize the imaginary side of that and make it real.
Mm-hmm. Do you think if someone does want to have like a meaningful long-term travel, it's important that they'll understand in their head that it is possible to do it, first of all.
Definitely. Yeah. I think attitude and mindset are the most important things that you can have for vagabonding, more so than any equipment or plane tickets. Equipment and plane tickets account for a lot, but you just have to realize that, one, it's something you can do. Two, you can go slow. And three, you don't have to obey the itinerary that you invented in your head. Since vagabonding has come out, the idea of the bucket list has become famous, and it's a great concept. But I think the great thing about a bucket list is that it gets you out the door, and then once you're traveling, you pretty quickly realize that there's things you'd never dreamed of for your bucket list that are as amazing as the things on your bucket list. And so that's I don't want to narrow my advice just to three things, but that's the third point right now, which is realize that every day you travel, you're going to be smarter. You're going to be finding things you never dreamed were possible. And so just allow yourself to be that way.
Mm-hmm. And for someone who does want to maybe start vagabonding or having these kind of experiences, which kind of mindset or attitude you think they should take if they haven't done it long-term before?
Well, I think it's a tough one to answer because, one, you don't really need a sense of urgency. Like if it's gonna be 2 years or 4 years before you have the money and the life freedom to do it, then realize that in a way that those travels can become a part of your travel attitude now. And so it's sort of a combination where I want people to relax and realize that travel is a creative act. It's not just a matter of making a plan and then following the plan. It's about going through the world and learning and improving yourself in ways that you never imagined. But at the same time, unless there's a little bit of discipline and structure, you're not going to get out of the door. So I guess the mindset should keep in mind flexibility while also being self-disciplined enough to make it happen and not to keep postponing it. And that's going to be different for everybody. Some people
makes sense.
Yeah.
All right. How did you improve yourself, you think, throughout your travels? Do you have some things which pop to mind? I mean, obviously you're doing it for 20 years, but can you think of like something which really helped improve yourself while you're traveling because you had this lifestyle?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is just that it helps me understand the world in a way. It helps me understand how other cultures are different and how pinched the life we lead at home can be. And I don't want to knock life at home, but every time we get received information about how the world works or certain cultures work or certain religions work, then that's just received information. That it's simplified and it's narrative, and it often serves a purpose other than simply informing us about things. So one thing I found again and again, including my travels this winter, is that in going to a place, you learn a far more complicated part about the world and how it works. And I think that can apply to all aspects of your life. I say in the book that you should put your vagabonding on your resume. You shouldn't hide it from your employers. And I think one of the skills that you can learn is that you suddenly have that skill. You're not learning about the world because you're reading about it or you're watching YouTube. You've been in the world. You have met people and made decisions, and you're going to have much more savvy in this increasingly globalized world to navigate the globalized world. And it's not just something that applies to business, but it certainly can apply to business.
Mm-hmm. Is there any place which you heard one thing on the news about, and then you realize this country or the city or whatever is completely different, maybe even the opposite?
Well, I would say that's every place. I'm from Kansas in the United States, which is usually understood is not a very famous place, right? So it's usually understood by people not from Kansas through a political lens. And the stereotype is political conservatism. And I think demographically, Kansas is a more conservative state, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the starting point of the way I live when I'm in Kansas. I live a pretty dynamic life in Kansas, and I think Kansas is pretty interesting. And that applies to every place. I mean, there's obvious places like since the war on terror, you go to a Muslim country, you go, not only is a place like Egypt or Lebanon more friendly than you would have expected, but they're totally different from each other. Just because they're Muslim countries that doesn't mean that they have a lot in common. And there's a sensibility that a Lebanese person will have that an Egyptian person doesn't have. I was just in Sri Lanka this winter. Sri Lanka has been in the news recently because of the Easter terrorist attacks, which is, troubling and a problem, but you don't get very much information about Sri Lanka when you read about bad things. And, the news is a man bites dog world. It's not a dog bites man, it's man bite dog world. And so I looked at the geography of those attacks in Sri Lanka, which happened after I'd been there, and they all happened on the coast. And I spent most of my time in the Central Highlands, so even if I would have been there, that wouldn't have touched my life that directly. Same with Sumatra. I was there this winter, and that is part of Indonesia, but these days everybody goes to Bali. That's an overgeneralization, but I think Sumatra is less popular with backpackers than it was 20 years ago, in part because it's cheaper to fly, and backpackers like each other, and so they go to Bali to hang out with each other and enjoy the weather. And so I just found all this complexity in Sumatra. Sumatra is a place where you don't even have that many stereotypes. Most people will say, "Oh, Sumatra, coffee," right? Whereas I went there and I realized that they have good coffee there. And you can get it every day, but it's like 20 cultures in 20 languages within a single place. And my time there just allowed me to get a taste of just how much is going on in a place like Sumatra.
Would you recommend people to go to Sumatra instead of Bali for someone who wants to just do some exploration?
Yeah. But I think some travelers, and I don't want to knock the travelers who just want to go and party and meet good looking other travelers and surf and like Bali is a good starting, like if you haven't done a lot of travel, it's not a bad place to start in Indonesia because the roads are good. I mean, the roads are full of tourists, full of people, and that's fine. But the odds of you having an interesting interaction with a Balinese person are lower than you having an interesting interaction with a Sumatran person and this happens so much that there's so few travelers in Sumatra these days, or maybe it's just the places I went, that just I was actively approached a lot of times. There's the selfie culture
by the
now,
locals?
by local people, yeah. Who wanted selfies, like all these high school students wanted selfies. And so like 20 years ago, pictures were very awkward because usually tourists had cameras and local people didn't. But in Sumatra, I found that local people and young people especially not only had cameras, but they wanted me to pose in their cameras because they weren't used to seeing Americans. So it was a lot of fun.
Uh-huh. Interesting. In your book, in the Vagabond book, you talk about a distinction between tourist and a traveler. Can you maybe share that distinction with people listening?
Well, that's a conversation that's been happening for a long time, and I don't really buy into it. I mean, I can see why people make a tourist traveler distinction, and in a way, I just sort of made one. Like I'm sort of saying, if I believed in that distinction, I'd say, oh, well, tourists go to Bali and travelers go to Sumatra, right?
Okay.
And so I think for a long time, people saw that there was a meaningful way to travel, and then there was sort of more of a consumerist way to travel. And then, so they said, oh, well, tourists are the consumerists and travelers are the meaningful travelers. But then it sort of became this fashion dichotomy. It became like a hipster thing, where it's just like, oh, well, I'm a traveler. And it's sort of a way of being cool. So I don't really believe in the rhetorical distinction anymore. Because I think too many people, it's like being in a nightclub and trying to pass yourself off as being the coolest person there. People spend so much time trying to seem like a traveler that they don't really travel that meaningfully. And often they'll go to a place like Bali that's full of other tourists, and then they'll have a contest among the tourists to see who's the most traveler-like. So it's a distinction that tried to identify this distinction between meaningful travel and superficial consumerist travel, but it has become complicated. And so I like to think that the distinction is less important than just traveling well and traveling meaningfully and traveling slowly in a way that goes beyond that consumer experience.
Mm-hmm. Can you maybe, if you touched on it, share the difference between traveling slowly and traveling in a more fast pace?
Well, I guess traveling at a fast pace sort of accords with how we live at home. We try to optimize everything. We micromanage our days, right? and we don't want to waste time. We don't want to spend any more time in place X than we need to. Whereas when you travel, going slow means not only like spending a month in Sumatra instead of spending 4 days there, or spending a month in Bali instead of spending a week there, but leaving yourself open so that you can, if you fall in love with the place, that you can stay for a while. That your travels are not so micromanaged that you have to leave every few days. Traveling slowly just allows you so many more options, so that you can sort of follow your passions and your heart instead of your itinerary.
Yeah, I can definitely agree. In my experience, it's been very, very similar every time I've stayed longer in a place versus 4 days, 7 days in a place. How do you keep your travels meaningful? What I mean is, like, in my experience, for example, after 5 years, sometimes it's a bit tough to do it more meaningful. 20 years is a long time. I'm assuming it's been different in the beginning and now. Like, how do you still keep this meaning in your life with your travels? Do you do anything different in order to get it?
Well, I've continued to, I started my vagabonding in my 20s, and now I'm in my 40s. And so life happens, whether you want to or not. So I got a house, I'm in my house now in Kansas, which is where I'm from. And that, like I said, is not a very sexy place, but it sure is a cheap place. If I'm going to be gone half the year, I may as well be near my family and in a place that I enjoy and can afford. So one way that I kept travel interesting is creating a sense of home. And I'm not saying that everybody's going to create a sense of home in the same way as me and go back to their hometown or their home state and build a life there. But that's one way to keep travel interesting. Also, relationships can structure the way that you travel, and traveling slowly lends itself more to relationships. It's one thing to visit a village and see a few events there, and it's another thing to live there for a year and make friends and do some work there. So I think variety is important, and then just acknowledging that if it's not a contest and it's not really a status thing, and if travel is going to be an integrated part of your life, then you have some non-travel parts of life too, like work and home and relationships and things like that. And so, again, it goes back to the idea of just sort of relaxing and not being so structured about things. Because if you're super structured about your 1 year trip, then it ends after a year and then you move on. Whereas if you think, oh, well, maybe this 1 year trip will last 9 months, but then I'll travel again when I feel like it, and travel can be more active part of my life, that's in a way more interesting than that 1 year trip. It's a way of increasing your options.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And what does home mean to you right now? Is it Kansas? Is it something else?
Well, I think home always, a lot of travel writers write about this. Pico Iyer, if you've read his writing, talks about home. He's more itinerant than I am. He's about a generation older than me too. So I think if travel is an important part of your life, then your definition of home includes the itinerant nature of travel, that in a way you sort of feel at home while you're traveling. And one thing about like traveling in Sumatra, for example, this winter is that I really felt in ways that I felt like 20 years ago, that I felt so comfortable on the road. Yet at the same time, I'm in home now, and it's really delightful to be home again in Kansas, even though it's much less exotic than Sri Lanka or the Republic of Georgia or other places I went this winter. But that it's just very specific to me. I have my books here, I have my family nearby, and that's just sort of the life I've created for myself. I think once you stop subscribing to the societal subscriptions for life, oh, you need an expensive car, you need the perfect girlfriend, you need this career that gets you this promotion, then once you start carving out your own way of being in the world, then you sort of figure it out. And I think I'm still learning. Like I was surprised this winter by how enjoyable and at home I felt when I was traveling across Asia.
Mm-hmm. So one part of it, if I understand right, is just feeling home with your own body or where you are, and just having this, how to piece it, like feeling of peace, of home with yourself.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And then often those are in conversation. Like if you have a place, and not everybody will be this way, if you have a place to go home to, like I do in Kansas, then that place becomes into conversation with the places that you go. You know, I know when I'm at home, I know I'm going to be leaving pretty soon. You know, I'm going to be in Europe this summer. So I'm in Kansas, but I'm already sort of thinking about other places. And when I'm at those other places, I know that, you know, if I'm tired or if there are certain things that I don't like in a place, well, then I can go and sort of recharge my batteries at home. And so it's absolutely a peace of mind that you cultivate wherever you are, but it's place-based too.
Mhm. Do you ever feel like you miss home or miss Kansas?
Yeah, sure. And then sometimes I'm in Kansas and I'm tired of being in Kansas, but yeah, and I think it happens about every year because in recent years I've gotten into the cycle where I travel all winter and then I'm more likely to be in Kansas in the spring and the fall. I'm not always here in the spring and the fall, and then I travel in the summer as well. And every year, especially in the winter, in the summer times too, I'll miss Kansas. It may only be for 10 minutes or a week, but I will miss home, and that's a good option to have. It's nice sometimes to have a home to miss because that gives you a little bit of stability to offset the unpredictability of travel.
Would you recommend for people who are traveling long term, I would say multiple years, to have such a place, a base at home, some place they can go and recharge their batteries?
Definitely, and I don't want to be fundamentalist about this. I'm sure that there's some travelers who have no equivalent of that and are doing fine. But I know that when I wrote Vagabonding, I got a residency hotel in Thailand. I didn't have a home. I didn't have my Kansas home yet. And that really became a psychic home for me, even though it was like $100 a month room in Thailand. And in some ways it was very comfortable. In some ways it wasn't very nice. But I found that after my book tour for Vagabonding back in 2003, I went back to that room in Thailand just because that was the place where I rested from my book tour. It was a strange thing. And I think eventually I realized that I needed a more meaningful definition of home. And it's interesting, I haven't thought about this for a while, but I lived in San Diego and New Orleans for a while. And then finally I got an opportunity to get this house here in Kansas, which was much less expensive than the other places I'd been living in. And so it's been perfect for me ever since then.
Cool. I have a travel related to the question related to traveling. How do you get away from being a tourist maybe these days when you're traveling? You partially talked about it in your book. Wondering if it's changed or if you could just share with people listening and like, how do you do it these days?
I don't think that the getting away from being a tourist is that much different than it was 20 years ago. Although I will say that now in the age of Instagram travel influencers, if you see 20 people waiting in line to take a selfie, then you're probably in a tourist zone, right? I think that it's interesting how the social media has really made famous places even more famous and even more exposed. And so my advice is really the same. Sometimes you can walk for 10 minutes in any direction from an over-touristed place and find a much more meaningfully travel-friendly place than the place where you were before. I use Paris as an example because I teach a class there every summer, but if it seems like there's too many tourists on the Champs-Élysées or the Champ du Mars, just walk for a while until you get to a neighborhood that isn't full of tourists, and odds are the dynamic will be different. Local people will be more interested in you. You're less likely to have to spend twice as much for that bottle of wine than you would have a few blocks away. And so the same thing can happen. Another thing that really occurred to me, because my house here in Kansas is in the country. It's a rural house. It's not in a city. When people talk about coming to the United States, they'll say, oh yeah, especially Europeans, because Europeans come to the United States a lot. They'll say, oh yeah, I went to New York, or I went to Vegas, and then the Grand Canyon, and then Los Angeles. And so it's all like national parks and cities, which are great, but oftentimes a great way to get out of an over-touristed place is one, find a less touristed neighborhood in a city, or two, just go to a small town you haven't heard of. I encourage a lot of European friends to go to Kansas, and what will happen is that Kansans will just think they're the most interesting people ever. I had a British friend who came here. She actually ended up marrying a guy from Missouri. They were just so interested in her English accent that she was interesting to them in a way that they wouldn't have been in Las Vegas, because Las Vegas has English travelers every day, and Kansas doesn't. So really that secret to getting away from tourist zones is to just go to a place that you don't know that much about. Go to a place that doesn't have a hashtag on Instagram, and see what it's like there. And the rewards of travel are just as rich. I think Sumatra is a good example, because Sumatra has surfing and sites and culture and food that are as great as Bali, but it's less Instagrammable these days. And so not as many people go there.
Yeah, you make me want to go to Sumatra, to be honest.
Yeah, no, you should.
You mentioned social media, and I have the following question for you. Do you think the phone and how it got advanced, it made travel any different? Like, for example, since you're traveling for 20 years, right now it's so easy to be stuck with your phone instead of people in front of you, and you have all the social media and there's Wi-Fi everywhere. I guess it wasn't the case even 10 years ago. Even 5 years ago, I think when I started, it wasn't 100% everywhere. So how do you think that potentially, if it did change traveling for you or for other people?
Well, it makes travel easier. The good news is it makes travel easier, and it eliminates the excuses for not going. And in fact, I'm using a lot of Sumatra examples. But when I was there, I kept running into travelers. Like, when I travel with my phone, I just use Wi-Fi. I don't buy data plans overseas. And then I met all these travelers, a lot of them young. Actually, I didn't meet that many travelers in Sumatra, but when I did meet travelers, they'd say, "Oh yeah, it costs $10 a month to get a data plan, for your cell phone." And so I can get information here, but oftentimes those same travelers would be staring at their phones, right, when they were at the Pacu Jawi cow races or on the ferry to the Mentawai Islands. And so that's the downside. That phone really makes travel easier. It gives you so many options. It allows you to book rooms on the run. It allows you to pull up maps, which is great. But it's also like taking a little phone-sized bit of home with you, that you're just more likely to be texting people back home and to falling into the same dumb habits, like watching Netflix. You're on the coast of Sumatra watching Netflix or listening to podcasts. I mean, I can knock Netflix, but I listen to a lot of podcasts even when I was traveling. And so there was another generation where maybe I would have gone out and had dinner or talked to somebody or been more interactive or forced myself to feel a little bit lonely or a little bit bored, so I would feel less lonely and bored and have a more organic experience. And so that it's a good thing to keep in mind. And I don't want to be the guy who's been traveling for 20 years who's shaking his fist at the younger generation saying, "Get off my lawn." But I think you should be cognizant of how much of a role the phone plays in your travels and how often it distracts you, because often it's far more than is enjoyable. And your phone can really make your day less interesting. It can make your day twice as easy and, a half as interesting if you didn't have it.
Yeah, it's so easy just being with phone instead of being with people. And I think it's one thing which can prevent people from fully experiencing a place. Are there any other reasons you don't get a data plan, or it's mainly just so you'll disconnect yourself a bit from home when you're traveling?
Well, I think it started because I'm stubborn and cheap, that I just didn't want to fuss with it. And it's like, again, I've been traveling for a long time, and not only did I not use a data plan 20 years ago, I didn't have a smartphone, and nobody had a smartphone. And so my skills and instincts are sort of pre-phone skills and instincts. That said, it's nice to pull up and see what the weather is like where you are, and use maps.me and see exactly where you are on the road. And so, yeah, it's being savvy with that. I was reading my journals from 1994, and I was amazed by how many people I met just because I started talking to who I was next to. And I was traveling with a friend, and we met a couple girls in Florida who went to university in Florida, because we parked in front of their hostel room. And I think that maybe these days, my friend and I would be looking at our phones and the girls would be looking at their phones. The odds that we would just start talking to somebody randomly, it's still possible, but phones keep us in our bubbles, in our own self-contained bubbles, more than they used to. And oftentimes those bubbles are giving us useful information, but we had a great time. We hung out with those girls for like 5 days, and it was a highlight of Florida. And there was no app that introduced us to those girls. We parked our car there and started talking to them. And so those are the kinds of experiences I think that you will remember the most, regardless of what gets filtered through your phone.
You mentioned a journal from that long ago. Do you still keep a journal? Like, do you journal about every place you go?
I don't. I stopped about 20 years ago because I was starting to do travel writing, and I found that it was easier to travel write if I just it's time consuming to do a journal every day, but then also I would just keep simple notes in a notebook, and I would pull my stories out of the notebook. Whereas when you journal, you're sort of telling the story of every day, and maybe the story of a given day isn't the real story for a travel writing magazine. Although I did change it this year, I kept a journal all winter. Last December, before I left for Sumatra and Sri Lanka and Georgia, I was reading some of my old journals, and I realized how enjoyable it was to reread them. So I kept a journal every day on the road this winter. It ended up being like 60,000 words long. It's like as long as a book. And it's not for, it's not for everybody. It's obviously it's just written for myself. And if I was writing an article or a book, it would be different. But
how different would it be?
Well, travel writing really has to keep the audience in mind. And so I would have to entertain people and keep their attention and help them understand why they are with me when I'm going to the Mentawai Islands off the coast of Sumatra. And I'd have to give them some history about that and some cultural information. Whereas when I'm writing in my journal, I already have internalized a lot of that history. I've internalized my own motivations. I don't need to entertain myself. I'm just writing down things that happened. And so, whereas a travel story is meant to be entertaining for someone who has no idea who I am, the journal is it's for the audience of me. And some people, someone who doesn't know who I am might get bored after their third page of reading about the Mentawai Islands, whereas it's interesting to me because it happened to me. So.
Interesting. Are you working when you're traveling, or are you having like separate times of just traveling or just working, since you're also a travel writer and you do different professional things?
It's a mix. There's no real separation anymore because like I'm a podcaster now. I write books that, for example, my experiences this winter will probably eventually go into a book about travel, but it's not that they were an assignment, right? So my travels were sponsored by podcast sponsors. AirTrex flew me across the Asia this winter because they're a sponsor for my podcast. And so like work sort of touches everything, even if I wasn't literally on assignment. So it wasn't like on assignment for National Geographic this winter, but I was taking notes. I was actually putting a lot of stuff on social media. I was taking a lot of photos, and I was preparing myself in ways that have become habit over the years and will inform my writing somehow, even if it wasn't for assignment at the time.
Mm-hmm. And do you think for other people who are working online, can they still vagabond, or in order to vagabond, you need maybe a period with no active work? Because today I'm asking, like, everyone can just take a freelance work. It's so easy to work anywhere online. And there are lots of people who are doing it, but then they end up working 8 hours a day. And sometimes I do it as well, to be honest, in a very exotic place. And I don't maybe get to experience because I'm not out there. Do you think there's separation, that there's one way to do it or right way to do it?
I don't think there's a right way to do it. And one thing to keep in mind is the flip side is that you're doing that 8 hours, at a less interesting place, and, you work for 8 hours at home, and then you go to the same restaurant that you always go to. You see the same friends you always see. When you're in a more digital nomad lifestyle, you do your 8 hours of work, and then you go out and you have amazing Thai food, or you go see the nightlife of Bolivia or wherever you are. And so I think it's good not to have zero sum thinking about this. That's all or nothing, that you're either traveling or you're not traveling. And so I think one advantage of that digital nomad lifestyle is, even though the work can be all consuming, and there's some days where maybe you're going to be staring at your computer in a beautiful place for 12 hours, you still have the option of going for a run in the Andes, or going for a hike in the Namib Desert, or wherever, or just meeting some people when you don't have time on. So for the digital nomads out there thinking about this, don't be discouraged if you feel like a workaholic in an exotic part of the world, because vagabonding can happen in small bits and pieces, and it can catch you by surprise sometimes.
Mhm. I wanted to ask you, what do you pack these days? You have so many years of experience. What goes into your bag? Like, what is your must list to put in your bag when you go and travel somewhere?
Well, as little as possible. 9 years ago, I went around the world for 6 weeks with no luggage at all. I just put a few things in my pockets, in pockets of a travel vest, and traveled, and it was fine. Right. That doesn't mean I've turned into a no luggage traveler. Although I've interviewed some no luggage travelers for this season of my podcast. They're going to come out later. I had a little. I also had a sponsor because of my podcast for my baggage. Tortuga Backpack sent me a 35-liter pack. It's not very big. Fits in an overhead bin. So a simple rotation of clothes, maybe 3 or 4 or 5 days is all you need, because you can keep your clothes clean. Otherwise, if you bring a week and a half worth of clothes, then half the time you're going to be carrying those clothes dirty around. It's better to just clean your clothes constantly than to be carrying a giant load of things that you're not necessarily going to use. And then, some practical things. I brought books on a Kindle. I have a lot of things that I use through my iPhone. I had some weather gear. I had a light rain jacket that I used quite a bit when I was motorcycling in the rain in Sumatra. I'm blanking. I guess I brought my computer because I do some work on the road and some research on the road. But the actual things I carry are very minimal now. The older I get, the less I carry, because if you really need something in a faraway place, then you can just buy it.
So do you carry less things right now than you were, let's say, 10, 15 years ago?
I'd say, yeah. I'd say yes. Definitely less than I traveled with 20 years ago during my first vagabonding journey across Asia, which lasted 2.5 years. It was a great trip, and I'll never match it in that it was so new that every day was exciting. But actually, if you look at the cover of Vagabonding, like the pack I'm on my back on the cover of that book is too big. It's been years since I've carried a pack that was that big. And not to make fun of myself or knock myself, because those were important travels. But now I know that I don't have to be tired because I've been carrying a too heavy pack all day. I don't have to have a bunch of equipment that I never use, because I've pretty much figured out exactly what I need. And often, even this winter, I found that there were some things that I didn't use. I brought a little collapsible umbrella that I used 0 times. So you still learn.
Interesting. I noticed on myself, having traveled the world the last 5 years, that in some places I've been much happier than other places. And I'm wondering if you're either experiencing the same, and what in general are the top 3 places you felt the happiest? I think the key focus here is happy around the world. Any specific cities or countries which you remember and you say, like, I was really happy there?
Well, recently or in my whole career? Because I'm drawing on 25 years worth of experience now.
Whatever comes to your mind. It can be recently, it can be also 20 years.
Well, there's so many, I'm very fond of New York. I know that's not a very exotic city because I'm from the U.S., but I really like New York. But there's sometimes where New York annoys me, like I feel like I've stayed there for too long. It's a very expensive place. But I've had some, if not happy moments, just some very dynamic and interesting moments in New York. And Paris is the same way, but like, when was it? Actually, last year I was in Hawaii, which amazed me. 2 years ago, I was in Namibia. Obviously, this year I was very fond of Sumatra. And I think, like, if you put Sumatra and Sri Lanka side by side, I would probably favor Sumatra. But that's because I sort of felt like I had it to myself. Like, I spent a lot of time on trains with other backpackers in Sri Lanka, and the backpackers were great. And actually, 28-year-old Rolf probably would have been more comfortable with all those backpackers. But Rolf in his 40s sort of enjoyed the luxury of being the only foreigner in Sumatra for days at a time. So it's I know I'm not answering your question in a very direct way, but it really depends. And I think it's sort of personality based, that I think to a certain extent I'm a little bit of a loner, which makes it good for me in foreign countries because I don't have to surround myself by other travelers, and I can just sort of walk through the streets and meet local people in a way that I wouldn't had I always needed a friend or other travelers to be with.
Mm-hmm. Okay, fair enough. Do you have any routines or habits which you do when you get to a new country or city, or it's really still random or adventurous to this day?
It's mostly random. I usually try to walk when I go to a place, like just walk and like get up early and then walk through the village or town or city or national park, because that's one thing that you can't do through your smartphone, right? You can watch videos from all over the world. You can look at maps from all over the world, but there's something about just being in a place and getting to know it by moving through it at your own pace. And so there, that's probably my best answer. There's just few exercises I have that compare to walking. And I know it doesn't sound very exciting, but it's a great way to get to know wherever you are. Just walk around, orient yourself. You'd be surprised sometimes by the things you discover just by walking for an hour near where you're staying.
Do you have an example of like getting to some place and you just start working and I don't know, some adventure happened or you learn something?
Yeah. What popped in my head, I was in Bukit Tinggi, Sumatra this winter, and I had heard of a dish, rendang, that I wanted to get. And so as I was looking up the definition of rendang online, I realized that there was a TripAdvisor who recommended a restaurant that was like 3 blocks away. So I walked to the restaurant and I had some rendang there and it was fine. But what happened is that to get to the restaurant, I walked through 3 blocks of street food tents. And then once my stomach was full, I realized that I didn't need that magical information about this famous restaurant, that the street food tents were far more interesting than that restaurant, which was completely empty. And is really designed for travelers. There's a lot of services that are designed to make travelers feel comfortable, whereas a much more dynamic and locally authentic street food scene was happening in the middle. And so I guess that's a negative example. If I had just gone out and started walking instead of looking up rendang online, then I would have found it very, very close and in a more dynamic way than had I gone in with this little nugget of advice that had probably been put online like 10 months before and maybe it was no longer relevant.
Got it. Do you do anything to maintain your health while you're traveling? You seem like a healthy guy. And since you're doing lots of travel, are there any things which you're doing to improve and optimize your health?
I did quite a bit this winter. I didn't drink in Sumatra and Sri Lanka, not necessarily because of health, but just because culturally not that many people drink in those places. And I didn't want to be like the lone foreigner nursing a beer when nobody else was drinking a beer. And I found that I became very healthy. I felt a little bit flabby after New Year's. Maybe everybody feels flabby after New Year's, but just by eating local food, eating rice, hiking a lot. I did a lot of swimming. And in Sumatra specifically, I would sometimes go to the gym. That I discovered that like for $1 to $3, you could go into a gym in Sri Lanka. And so I lifted weights. I've never really done that before, but it was a nice thing to get into my routine. And it's another way to hang out with local people. Like I was the only non-Sri Lankan people in the gym. So yeah, I'm trying to think. I did a little bit of running this winter. Running is my old sport. But I found I did enough hiking that I didn't really need to run that much. Did some push-ups and some core work, but mostly just being out and being active and walking. That was 75% of my exercise, I think, of my health regimen. Walking a lot and eating local.
Yeah, those are great tips. Just walking and moving your body a bit more.
Yeah.
I had a following question. If right now you have to leave a legacy in form of books, maybe to your kids or children, which 3 books would you recommend?
Gosh, that's tough. I don't have kids. And so part of me thinks, well, it sort of depends on the kid.
Hypothetically, let's say you do want to leave like something, since you have so much experience and learning from travel. Are there a few books which come to mind which you would want them to read, or you would want someone to read?
Well, I'd probably leave them Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, because that was written more than 150 years ago, but I found it very relevant.
What's the name again?
Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman. It's poetry, actually. It's very American poetry. In fact, Walt Whitman sort of invented a more vernacular style of poetry in the mid 19th century when he wrote that. But it's about recognizing what's important in life. You know, there's a lot of values in there about keeping your eyes open and living the life that you want to live. So there's like sort of the American 3-pack of like Whitman, Thoreau, and either Emerson or Muir, which have some good. I mean, I distilled a lot of that philosophy into Vagabonding, but I found that my own philosophy when I was younger was informed by those American writers who were basically saying, look, you can be different. You know, you can follow your heart, so to speak. So probably Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass for sure I would give to anybody. And then the rest would really depend on people's given personality. Like I just read William Finnegan's Barbarian Days this winter. I love that book. It's a surfing memoir. It has a lot of travel in it. But it just felt like it captured the life of an interesting person who was also trying to live thoughtfully. You know, so if I had a friend who might be given towards surfing or swimming or something like that, I might get him that book. So it really depends. Walt Whitman is my go-to, but there's dozens of other books, including probably Vagabonding. I mean, I wrote it in such a way that, you know,
I would recommend that for sure in mine. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. It's like a lot of people have said, yeah, I told my parents I was going to travel and they freaked out, and then I gave them Vagabonding and now it makes sense to them. So it's almost as if, I don't know if I intentionally wrote it to be gifted, but it certainly is gifted a lot, and it distilled a lot of philosophy from books that changed my life. So
yeah, I'll track those books and I'll put them in the show notes for anyone listening in. We are getting closer to the end of the show. Is there anything else we didn't cover which you want to add, which can help anyone listening in maybe to have a more meaningful travel, or in general a meaningful life, which seemed to be like the theme of what we're talking today?
well, I definitely, if travel is something you want to do, decide that it's going to happen. Even if you can't do it in a year or 5 years or 10 years, just decide that it's going to happen, and then it becomes a part of you. And then once you start traveling, just know that travel doesn't need to be a consumer experience. It's not about what you have on your list, or what you're gonna buy in advance, or what you're going to arrange. It's not about logistics. It's about what happens as you go from place to place. And that's easy to forget. And that's something that applies to life too. I mean, there's an old phrase that says life is what happens when you're making other plans, right? Travel can be the same thing. If you're too obsessed with your plans just enable the experience to happen. So remember that the planning is good, and travel hacking or saving money, there's all sorts of strategies that are good. But travel is a great way to get to know who you are and get to know what you love, and to surprise yourself. And so just be cognizant of that. I guess also, you know, realize, I don't think I fully appreciated this when I was younger, that other cultures are different, you know, just be humble and emphasize listening when you're in other places, because sometimes everything you read about another place is going to make less sense than just hanging out and meeting people from there and listening, instead of trying to project your expectations on that place.
Mm. Interesting. Rolf, where would you want to send people online to find you, or your books? Are there any specific places you would want them to check out?
They can go to rolfpotts.com, which is my author website. I've had it for 21 years. And it's actually funny. It's like, that's sort of an anachronism for a lot of millennials and younger people. It's like, oh, well, what about your Instagram? I don't care about your website, right? So they can go to @RolfPotts for Twitter or Instagram, but really, rolfpotts.com has been there for 20 years, and it really distills 20 years of information and thoughts, and it has a lot of writing from my travel this winter. It links to all the books I've written, to most all of the articles I've written. That's rolfpotts.com, and it talks about the classes I teach, and it talks about my podcast. It's just a good place to dig in and just sort of follow what interests you.
Very cool. I will link all of these things that you mentioned in the show notes. Rolf, thank you very much for taking the time today to speak to us, and thank you very much for writing the Vagabonding book. If anyone didn't read it and thinks about travel, I think it's a must read for travelers. So thank you very much.
All right. Thank you. And good luck on the road. Maybe 5 years will become 10 years. We'll see.
Maybe. We'll have to see. Take care.
All right.